welcome to this IOSCO Asia Pacific webcast. And as they say nowadays, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are. Now, operational resilience at first sight seems like a very easy topic to deal with. And when we put this proposal for work to the IOSCO board, it was very easily approved. Who could disagree with looking at operational resilience in the current environment? But once you actually start drilling down in terms of what does it mean and what should you do, it suddenly becomes a much more difficult topic. And these questions and dilemmas around resilience is something that I think we observe in everyday life. For example, there's quite a lot of discussion nowadays about how do we raise children to be resilient. To what extent should we provide them with rules and instruction about how to be resilient, and to what extent should we let them learn them from themselves? How can we ensure that when they face challenges, they bounce back more resilient and are not broken? And we as regulators in some ways are in a similar sort of loco parentis situation with the firms that we regulate. When we're looking at resilience, we need to draw a careful balance between the extent to which we set detailed rules or granular guidance, or the extent to which we set outcomes, the extent to which we get involved when incidents occur, or step back and let firms deal with it themselves. Now, clearly, operational resilience is not new, but the last couple of years have come as rather an unexpected or perhaps even implausible surprise. And therefore, this is quite actually a good juncture for us to reevaluate or look again at how we approach operational resilience. Now, clearly, this situation is evolving, and this is not an easy task, which is why the IOSCO board chose a couple of resilient chairs to lead this work. So I'm happy to welcome, first of all, Tracy Stern, the Vice Chair of Committee C2 at IOSCO, and Clessa Aldridge, the Vice Chair of Committee C3, who are leading the IOSCO Operational Resilience Group. They received a mandate back in June and have been working over the summer on a consultation paper, which looks at operational resilience for trading venues and intermediaries. And we're here to find out what their thoughts are on these issues. So to start at the beginning, Tracy, what does operational resilience actually mean? And how have regulators approached operational resilience in the past? And what's spurred the sort of recent or renewed attention to operational resilience?
Thank you for inviting me to talk about operational resilience. I think it's safe to say that we have all had a good dose of and a real test of the operational resilience planning that everybody has been doing over the last number of years. Operational resilience is the ability of an entity, and in our case, a regulated entity, to deliver critical functions through disruption. We know that disruptions are inevitable, but it's essential to prepare for that inevitability. And so operational resilience really ensures that an entity can continue operating even when faced with diversity disruptions that would impact its functions. It's the holistic view of the entire operation of an entity and the outcome of the examination of risks and the planning as to how to manage them. It is included in operational resilience is the ability for an entity to protect itself against threats and against potential failures. In facilitating operational resilience, a key part is the business continuity planning that we have all been talking about for a long time. The need to plan for the business to continue to operate the various functions individually. Operational resilience is more of a holistic view of the entity and how all of its pieces fit together. Also critical in the operational resilience process is the post-disruption review. What have you learned? What have you missed? Identifying the gaps, adjusting the planning, and so that supports the operational resilience for next time. And there's always a next time. IOSCO has been working on BCP planning, risks associated with technology and managing those risks for a while. And there are a number of papers that have been done by IOSCO. In addition, many other regulators have been looking at it over the last number of years. And I think the pandemic really brought the need to examine it closely, establish some standards, some guidelines, some best practices, and to really take a look at what we've done over the course of the pandemic, and see how we can all improve our operational resilience.
Mm. Yes, I mean, sort of like you say, you sometimes have to fight a battle more than once to win it. So yeah, turning to you, Calissa, we're obviously facing a new challenge. So how has the pandemic impacted operational resilience? And how did regulators respond to support financial firms and facilitate their responses more generally?
Thanks, Giles. And look, the pandemic has been an incredible real-world test of operational resilience, hasn't it? It's tested operational resilience by stretching crisis management, business continuity, disaster recovery, and supplier management arrangements on a scale and in ways that many of us just had not anticipated. There have been sudden and sustained border closures impacting the movement of people, separating families and colleagues, constraining cross-border business activities and leading to talent shortages in some markets. The closure of offices, factories, and other workplaces have crippled production and supply of many goods and services. And the sudden shift to remote working for entire workforces in most jurisdictions, where many firms weren't equipped initially to support the number of staff working from home. There were periods of extreme market volatility and record trading volumes that challenged the capacity of trading venues and intermediaries. There's been a rapid adoption of new technology to support remote working, like video conferencing, and new products and services. And urgent adjustments have been required to outsourced and offshored services where some providers couldn't meet their service level agreements. For some trading venues that use open outcry trading floors, they had to quickly transition to electronic trading. The New York Stock Exchange closed its trading floors for a period to comply with stay-at-home orders, as did the London Metals Exchange. And intermediaries quickly adapted to servicing their clients remotely, even through that extreme market volatility and with very active corporate M&A activity. So we've been really pleased with the ability of trading venues and intermediaries to continue to provide critical operations throughout the pandemic. They've proved to be largely very resilient, and it's been a real testament to the work done by regulators and firms on operational resilience over the last decade, and really since the global financial crisis. You also asked about what regulators have done to support firms during the pandemic. Many regulators were quick to respond to operational challenges that firms were facing. For example, by providing relief from requiring wet signatures on documents, in-person meetings, some elements of telephone recording requirements, and extending timelines for regulatory reporting. Some regulators reprioritized their work and delayed certain regulatory activities and the introduction of new regulations. In the context of the extreme market volatility and high trade numbers that we saw in the early part of the pandemic, some regulators took a more active role in supporting the resilience of the market. For example, in one jurisdiction, the regulator stepped in to cap trades to manage capacity issues with the market infrastructure. In others, regulators adjusted position limits and margin requirements to ensure investors met their obligations in the fast-moving market. So regulators have really played an important role in facilitating firms to maintain their operational resilience throughout the pandemic.
Okay, that's very interesting, Calissa. As has been alluded to, Tracy, I mean, these operational risks have underlined the importance of both risk management and business continuity plans. So could you provide us with some examples of the measures that have been taken by both intermediaries and trading venues to implement their BCPs?
I think overall, in the context of the regulated entities, they fared very well when facing the pandemic. They were able to continue to operate in the early days and were able to shift very quickly to remote work. From a trading venue perspective, most are currently reliant on technology. And so they were able to shift and just adjust to people working from home. But those that aren't, as Calissa mentioned, closed their floors for a while, and they shifted to online trading. Many intermediaries also rely on technology, and so they were able to reach their clients or process orders. They may have had bandwidth issues in the early days, which was subsequently solved as time went on. The planning that has gone into business continuity planning has been critical during the pandemic. And, based on the work that IOSCO has done and a lot of the other regulators have done, and regulated entities were largely ready. And some of the, the key areas that were in place, or key aspects that were in place, really helped to facilitate the prolonged period of time within which folks were working from home, that there was reliance on technology, changes in processes, those kinds of things. In terms of some of the critical aspects, governance and the ability to quickly make decisions to shift work to remote was critical in the context of the early days of the pandemic. Businesses, and in particular the regulated entities, were able to adopt new technology very quickly. They were able to decide on information security practices, where they needed to be enhanced. They were able to input or impose new processes so that it would be seamless or seemingly seamless for them to continue to operate from home, including compliance and oversight by their compliance individuals. Another key element was communication between entities, between regulators. Regulators work closely with industry bodies and governments to discuss next steps, to discuss expectations, to discuss how to adjust. And at least we found that there was enhanced and really a lot of sharing of information, and people were as open as they could be, sharing of ideas in terms of how to deal with the pandemic and how to adjust was also very important. The regulators were able to identify the challenges. They were able to give relief to regulatory requirements where required. And there was a general, I guess, acceptance that this would be something that would evolve over time, in the sense that the arrangements that were in place at the beginning of the pandemic would evolve and strengthen over the time that the pandemic would continue, so that some of the gaps that you may have seen, or some of the increased challenges you may have seen in the early days, were solved within, I would say, 2 to 3 months into the pandemic. People found workarounds to address it. So I think the key takeaway from all of this is this was really a very large, unexpected test of everybody's business continuity planning and operational resilience. And so in that context, you always have to learn from a disaster. So that was what we were charged to do, is to look at the gaps and the lessons learned, and to encourage everybody to adapt their BCPs to deal with those.
Okay, and Kalissa, so what are the challenges that the sudden shift to remote working created?
So there's no question it was a challenge for the industry and for everybody. We as the regulators also had some real challenges there. And as Tracy said, we were thrown into these work from home orders overnight with very little warning. And look, there've been a range of challenges. Firms needed to support their staff to quickly establish their work from home environments. In some jurisdictions, there were initially some supply shortages of hardware like computer monitors and keyboards. There were limitations with remote access in some cases, requiring firms to operate with a skeleton staff for a period. There were new challenges for communicating with colleagues and clients. Many entities had to embark on a speedy rollout of new or expanded forms of communication, video conferencing, and other collaboration tools. And it's been quite an adjustment for many to transition to that virtual world. And there have been a range of technology, security, staffing related challenges to go with it. And I know we'll walk through some of that today. There have been challenges with onboarding new staff, including the delivery of electronic devices, training, and trying to embed the desired work ethic and culture. Firms have needed to think carefully about how to oversee their key risk takers when working at home, the traders, the sales staff. Many deployed new or enhanced surveillance tools and additional controls to monitor their staff. So there's been an awful lot to consider and adapt to with remote working in a short period of time. And it's not that firms hadn't contemplated working from home in their BCPs. I just don't think they'd anticipated the scale and the duration of the disruption. Many plans had assumed that working from home arrangements would be short-term and applied to limited key staff rather than entire workforces for prolonged periods. But I think firms have really stepped up to the challenge. They've innovated and collaborated with their peers in a way that we just haven't seen before, at least not on this scale.
Yes, I mean, as you say, sort of technology has been quite front and center in terms of the challenges that have arisen. So perhaps, Tracy, could you expand on sort of what the technology challenges are, including, what cyber risks have arisen? And another issue that's also sort of popped up is the extent to which dependence on third-party providers may also create risks. So I'd be interested to hear from you about, what measures people can take to address these.
So Calissa mentioned a number of the technology risks, the shift in the adoption of new technology. A lot of people used Zoom at the beginning and then subsequently found that it may not have been as secure as they had hoped. So there was a lot of shifting around and there are all these new technologies that we're all using to talk to each other. A lot of mute buttons still being pushed almost 2 years into the pandemic. So that's still providing people with amusement. I think, another, things to think about and risks that we're focused on or that people faced were the fact that offices were decentralized. So, when you have people working on technology or signing into technology in a workspace, there are more measures in place to manage cyber, to manage information security. When you decentralize that and people work from home and they're working on Wi-Fi that isn't so secure, there are a lot of concerns relating to that. People are printing at home. I've just learned that if you get rid of your printer, you have to clear the memory of your printer because whatever you've printed is still in the printer. That was news to me. So I think there were a lot of considerations in the context of figuring out how to protect the network, how to protect the information. There was a rollout of VPNs that happened after a number of weeks, months, since people were working from home. And as I said before, the governance of the entities really allowed quick adoption of the technology where folks needed to roll it out really quickly. I think the question will be, once this is done, is to test that technology. Maybe people are doing that now to make sure that it is secure, that it's protected, there's good cyber hygiene. I think the trend of increasing reliance on outsourcing has occurring since before the pandemic. I think really since people started relying more and more on technology, and that regulated entities. I think some now say they are technology firms, but in the early days they were not. And so when dealing with a trading engine, for example, exchanges had the choice of building it in-house or outsourcing to a third-party vendor who had more expertise or perceived expertise. And so a lot of them had done that. So we had done some significant outsourcing work in the early days of the reliance on technology, both C2 and C3. There is a recent paper on outsourcing that's been issued. The regulators, we really had focused on a number of principles in those two papers: due diligence of a third-party provider, service level agreements, including termination, oversight of those activities. The pandemic raised questions relating to what happens when there are differing restrictions in differing jurisdictions. So when your outsourcing of functions is offshore and the people that are providing that service can't get into the office, you need to consider how to bring that function onshore if those restrictions are prolonged. So that's a complication that we obviously hadn't thought about in the context of the work that we had done. There were also issues about making sure that the employees of the third-party provider were also putting in practices that would protect information security, that would protect against cyber attacks. And so, it's sort of a double layer to make sure not only your organization is doing the right thing, but also the entity that you've outsourced your critical functions to is doing the right thing to protect the system, the information, and continue to operate through, a challenging time.
Okay, well, so obviously, technology is a challenge, but I mean, it also creates technology solutions there. But I mean, one issue that's often cropped up or that I've heard about recently, and I think is particularly relevant for firms and regulators in emerging economies, is that a lot of these technology solutions may potentially be unaffordable to some firms or regulators, or they might not otherwise have access to these solutions. So, I mean, how do you think this problem should be addressed, Tracy?
You have to look at what the operational parameters are within the individual countries and the individual regions. You have to look at what makes sense and what's available. And I think it really depends on the particular circumstances of the environment within which you're working. And so if paper is critical, then you have to plan for using paper. If you do have technology, but it's limited in its nature or its scope, you have to make arrangements or plans for that. I think any circumstances where you have technology being used, you have to plan for protection against cyber attacks and leakage of information, information security. You have to put it in the right parameters for access, control those. When people come, when people go, how do you control access to the technology? So I think with developing countries as well as developed countries, it's really all about the environment within which you work and making sure that you take into account the characteristics of the consumers, the investors in our case, and take into account what's available and what you can do if what's available doesn't work.
Okay, interesting. Also, that's the sort of technology side, but I mean, there's obviously a very interesting human angle to the pandemic. I mean, remote working and other effects have clearly created problems for many firms and regulators' workforces. So, Calissa, could you perhaps expand on what these challenges have been and how they can be addressed?
Thanks, Giles. Look, I think this is a really important lesson from the pandemic, and perhaps, in my mind at least, potentially the most important lesson. Prior to the pandemic, many BCP arrangements were overly focused on systems with relatively limited focus on the needs of staff or the implications of longer term changes in work practices. So the pandemic's raised a range of workforce challenges, including for those entities that retained a physical workforce in either the primary or backup or both locations. There have been challenges in keeping those environments safe. Many governments have imposed mandatory mask wearing, limitations on the number of people in confined spaces. There's also been a need to have specialised deep cleaning of workspaces. And as I mentioned before, remote working has created challenges for onboarding of new staff, including training. And with that, you lose that incidental learning and insights that you can only obtain from observing and overhearing others in the workplace, and the embedding of the sort of work ethic and culture. We've also seen in many jurisdictions that school closures resulted in extended periods of homeschooling, which divided the focus of staff and created additional stress. In many cases, staff were working longer hours and there were risks of being overwhelmed, burned out, or experiencing a decline in their morale. There've also been concerns about a lack of engagement or focus and how that could lead to ineffective decision-making or mistakes, which could impact the services being provided from firms to their clients. So for example, leading to the provision of poor advice or delays in providing services. And of course, there's been illness and death from those infected with the coronavirus and about fears about actually contracting the virus as well. And there've been a range of very concerning social challenges, like an increase in the incidence of domestic violence and substance abuse in the home, which could be contributing to longer term challenges for staff wellbeing and mental health. And firms have had to enhance the focus on health, safety and wellbeing with additional services, training, and providing greater flexibility for team members. So the human element of this pandemic has been incredibly important, and it really warrants greater focus on the operational resilience arrangements of firms in future. I think on the whole, we've been able to all of us, not just the industry, been able to adapt well and respond to those needs of staff. But I do think it was a key sort of deficiency, or was lacking in some of those arrangements prior to going into this pandemic.
That's a very interesting point. I mean, sort of going on, I mean, as well as the technology and human angle, there's also a sort of bread and butter financial market side to this pandemic. As you may be aware, many markets saw hugely increased volumes and volatility, particularly last year. And more recently, this has also been accompanied by a large increase in retail market participation. So Tracy, I mean, how do you think this has increased or affected operational and other conduct type risks?
I think I'm gonna deal with them two separate things. One is the early volatility in the March, April of 2020. And then I'll talk about the retail participation and the increase in the retail participation. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was huge volatility, March, April. I think that's really related to the fact that people didn't know what was going to happen. And so there was a lot of uncertainty in the market. There was a lot of uncertainty in terms of participation and how things would go over the next little while. And so some of the early markets early in the pandemic were extremely volatile. Some measurements had them more volatile than during the early days of the global financial crisis. We had a lot of circuit breakers going off in North America, where markets were stopped multiple times in a row, which is unheard of in the context of the circuit breakers in North America. And the circuit break and the disruptions in markets were not due to outages, because as we said before, that the exchanges, the markets had really planned for volume and had scaled up their volume, and the messaging, especially during the pandemic, we saw that the messaging numbers exploded. But the disruptions are really related to the volatility and the circuit breakers, and they really operated as they were designed, in terms of letting the market take a pause, take a breath. However, because of the uncertainty of the pandemic, the volatility continued. I think in April or so, that volatility settled down. People sort of dug in, prepared for a long wait. And so the volatility in the market relating to the uncertainty relating to the pandemic came down. I think the other factor that was thrown in was the retail participation and the increased retail participation. I don't know, and we don't know why that was spurred on. It could be people were bored at home. It could be that they had access to their phones, they weren't at work. It could be because of ease of access. But also a lot of firms had rolled out apps that would allow people to trade easily. And so really what we saw was an explosion of retail participation. I think in the early days, some of the retail brokers couldn't handle the influx. They were slow in the context of onboarding. There were some issues in the context of being able to manage all of the volume of trading requests that they were getting, the orders they were getting from retail, because they didn't have the bandwidth to do it. But I think, over the course of the pandemic, again, this has settled a little bit. There still is a lot of retail participation where there wasn't before, likely to continue. I think that the issue will be trying to address some of the risks that brings, and making sure that retail investors are educated about what they're purchasing, how they're purchasing, to understand the risks involved in investing, and that they that they are well informed in making their decisions. So I think that's one of the lessons learned in the context of retail participation that came in really quickly during the pandemic, is for regulators and regulated entities to educate, the role that we have in education, and to make sure that people are well informed.
Well, this is clearly a sort of very deep and broad topic, but unfortunately, given the time constraints we have, I only have time for one more question. So I'll perhaps just turn to you, Calissa. First of all, could you tell me why is this something that requires an international approach? And in particular, what is the value added that IOSCO can bring here? And secondly, I mean, in a nutshell, I mean, which areas of operational resilience do you think need either improving or updating or further work?
Thanks, Giles. So operational resilience is relevant for all entities in all markets around the world, and regulatory alignment enables those entities operating across border to better implement consistent controls and best practice. Jurisdictional differences can result in additional complexity and cost, and that is especially unhelpful for something like operational resilience, where the clarity and simplicity of controls and the ability to execute plans and minimize disruptions are really key. Operational resilience has been an important focus for IOSCO and other international standard bodies over many years, because the impact of a disruption can have a significant impact on the delivery of important financial services and the financial well-being of consumers. And the pandemic is a unique test case that we must learn from and grow from. So where do I think that IOSCO can add value? It's been a key objective for us to not reinvent the wheel with this work. So we've gone through this process of reviewing the guidance provided by IOSCO already and other international bodies. And I think we'd say that we largely think that it sufficiently covers the field. So we've concluded that for trading venues and intermediaries, that the existing IOSCO guidance on managing electronic trading risk, business continuity, recovery planning, those sorts of things, should continue to provide the core structure when considering operational resilience. But we have identified 6 themes or key lessons from the pandemic that we think entities should consider when to enhance their operational resilience. And I'll just quickly run through those now. The first is that operational resilience extends beyond technology. It depends as much on the entity's processes, premises, and staff as its technology when faced with a significant disruption. The second is the importance of really understanding the dependencies and interconnectivity across the full business to understand the potential consequences when one or more aspects of an operation are disrupted. And critical to this is the role of service providers and offshore services that Tracy was talking about earlier. 3 is the importance of reviewing, updating, and testing those business continuity plans and the scenarios to factor in the lessons learned from the pandemic, including that operations may not be restored for quite some time, and that borders may be closed, supply chains may be impacted, and staff may be dispersed for extended periods of time. 4 is the importance of effective governance frameworks. The pandemic really highlighted the importance of having those robust and effective governance frameworks to facilitate and support novel and really fast-paced decisions and changes. But also really importantly, that when decisions are made under pressure or risks are accepted without the usual sort of due diligence, that you've got to go back and revisit those decisions and do some back testing. 5 is that firms should review their compliance and supervisory processes, including the monitoring and supervision arrangements that were put in place for those workforces that were working from home, to ensure that they continue to be effective as hybrid working environments become more of the norm going forward. And finally, the 6th one is information security risk. That decentralized remote workforce can increase information and cybersecurity risks. So this remains a key risk and priority for IOSCO and many regulators. And information security is critical to operational resilience. So they're the 6 additional themes that we think are important for trading venues and intermediaries to consider to enhance their operational resilience. It's not proposed that they're additional guidance. We think that they're largely covered in the existing guidance, but we think they add additional context to how entities might go about enhancing their resilience.
Okay, well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. But I'd like to first of all thank you, Tracy and Calissa, for these extremely useful insights on operational resilience. And I'd also like to thank the IOSCO Asia Pacific Hub for hosting this useful webinar. As a final message, I'd just like to highlight that this is a two-way street. You've heard from Tracy and Calissa about some of the issues that are touched upon in more detail in the consultation paper that we've just published. I'd like to say that we'd be equally interested to hear from you on your views about these issues. Clearly, events are still developing and evolving, and there may be things that we have missed. So please respond to that consultation report, both in terms of substantive and new comments. Thank you and goodbye.